On the morning of August 4, 1981, a father drove to his daughter's house expecting nothing more than a routine visit. Minutes later, he would make a discovery so horrifying that it would leave Colorado detectives searching for answers for more than 40 years. The killer believed he had erased every trace of himself. He was wrong. One tiny piece of evidence would survive, waiting decades for science to catch up. Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, was known as one of the safest communities in the state. Quiet streets, beautiful homes, and friendly neighbors made it almost impossible to imagine a violent crime taking place there. People left for work without locking every door. Children played outside until sunset, and neighbors knew one another by name. That peaceful reputation was shattered on a warm August morning in 1981. 32-year-old Sylvia Mae Quayle was living alone after separating from her husband. Friends described her as independent, kind, and hardworking. She loved spending time with her family and rarely went a day without speaking to someone close to her. Because of that, when nobody heard from Sylvia for an unusually long time, her family immediately sensed something wasn't right. Her father tried calling several times. No answer. He waited. Called again. Still nothing. At first, he assumed she had stepped out for groceries or was visiting a friend. But as the hours passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. A feeling no parent wants to experience slowly took hold. He got into his car and drove toward Sylvia's home. The neighborhood looked perfectly normal. Children were riding bicycles. Cars were parked neatly along the street. Nothing suggested that behind one front door, a nightmare was waiting. When he reached the house, he noticed something unusual. The home was completely quiet. He knocked once. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then he tried the front door. It opened. Inside, the house felt strangely still. The television wasn't on. No music. No footsteps. Only silence. He called Sylvia's name. Again. No answer. As he walked deeper into the house, his heartbeat grew faster. Then, he saw her. Sylvia was lying on the living room floor. He immediately called for help. Within minutes, police officers, detectives, and paramedics rushed to the scene. The first responders quickly realized there was nothing they could do. Sylvia had been brutally murdered. Investigators secured the entire property with crime scene tape. Detectives began photographing every room exactly as they found it. Every object inside the house became potential evidence. What immediately puzzled investigators was that the house showed very few signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been ransacked. Valuable items remained untouched. This didn't look like a burglary gone wrong. It looked personal. But why Sylvia? Who wanted to hurt her? And how had they entered the house without attracting attention? Those questions would haunt investigators for decades. Outside, neighbors gathered behind police tape, watching silently as forensic teams carried boxes of evidence from the home. Rumors spread almost immediately. Some believed Sylvia knew her attacker. Others thought a stranger had targeted her at random. But at that moment, no one knew the truth. What detectives didn't realize was that the person responsible had unknowingly left behind something microscopic at the crime scene. In 1981, it wasn't enough to identify a killer. But 43 years later, that tiny clue would become the key to solving one of Colorado's most haunting cold cases. The moment detectives entered Sylvia Mae Quayle's home, they knew they weren't dealing with an ordinary homicide. Every room was frozen in time. A cup sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been. Nothing inside the house suggested that Sylvia had been planning to leave. There were no packed bags, no signs of panic, and no indication that she had expected danger to arrive at her front door. For experienced investigators, that detail immediately stood out. Whoever entered the house either gained Sylvia's trust or entered without forcing their way inside. Crime scene technicians spent the next several hours documenting every inch of the property. Hundreds of photographs were taken before anything was moved. Fingerprints were carefully lifted from doors, windows, furniture, and household items. Every strand of hair, every fiber, and every possible biological sample was collected with extreme care. Even in 1981, detectives understood something important. Technology would continue improving. Evidence collected today might answer questions years later. Outside the home, officers began knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood. One neighbor reported seeing Sylvia the previous evening. She appeared completely normal. Another remembered noticing an unfamiliar vehicle driving slowly through the street, but couldn't provide a license plate. A delivery driver recalled seeing the front door partially open earlier that morning, though he assumed nothing was wrong. Unfortunately, none of those statements identified a suspect. As investigators built Sylvia's timeline, they interviewed everyone connected to her life: family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors, even people she had spoken to only days before her death. Every interview was recorded, every statement compared. Detectives quickly learned that Sylvia had recently separated from her husband, making her personal relationships an important part of the investigation. But after extensive questioning, no immediate evidence connected any family member or acquaintance to the murder. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed the initial examination of the crime scene. Their findings painted a disturbing picture. The attack had been violent. The killer appeared to have remained inside the home longer than expected. Most importantly, the suspect had unknowingly left behind biological evidence. In 1981, DNA profiling was still in its infancy. Investigators couldn't yet identify a suspect from that evidence. But instead of discarding it, they carefully preserved every sample inside secure evidence storage. That single decision would one day change everything. As news of Sylvia's murder spread across Colorado, telephone lines at the police department were flooded with tips. Some callers believed they had seen suspicious people in the area. Others offered theories with no supporting evidence. Detectives followed every lead. One by one, each lead collapsed. Weeks turned into months. The investigation expanded across multiple states. Dozens of people were questioned. Several individuals voluntarily provided fingerprints and other evidence. Nothing matched. No arrests were made. The media slowly stopped covering the case. Public attention shifted elsewhere. But inside the police evidence room, Sylvia's file continued growing thicker. Boxes filled with reports, photographs, laboratory results, interview transcripts, and one sealed envelope containing biological evidence that nobody could yet fully understand. Years later, when DNA technology finally became available, detectives believed the mystery was about to end. They had no idea the hardest part of the investigation was only beginning. As months turned into years, the investigation slowly began to lose momentum. Detectives had interviewed friends, neighbors, co-workers, former acquaintances, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Sylvia Mae Quayle. Hundreds of pages of reports filled the case file. Every possible lead had been explored, yet the investigation remained trapped in the same place it had started. There was no eyewitness, no confession, no suspect. Eventually, the case received a label that every detective hates to hear: cold case. For Sylvia's family, those two words felt like another tragedy. To them, cold didn't mean the pain had disappeared. It simply meant investigators had run out of answers. But inside the evidence room, something incredibly important remained untouched. The biological evidence collected from Sylvia's home. Unlike witness memories, DNA doesn't fade with time. It remains exactly the same. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic science changed dramatically. Laboratories around the United States began using DNA profiling to identify suspects in violent crimes. Detectives handling Sylvia's case immediately realized they finally had another chance. The preserved evidence was carefully removed from storage and sent to forensic experts. Weeks later, scientists successfully developed a complete DNA profile believed to belong to the killer. For the first time since Sylvia's murder, investigators felt genuine hope. "If this person has ever been arrested," one detective reportedly said, "we're going to find him." The DNA profile was submitted into the FBI's national database known as CODIS. This system compares crime scene DNA with DNA collected from convicted offenders and other tense criminal investigations across the country. Everyone expected the computer to return a match. Hours passed, then days, then weeks. Nothing. The screen remained empty. No match. Detectives checked again months later. Still nothing. Years continued passing, and every time the database was updated with new offender profiles, investigators searched once more. Again, nothing. The realization was frustrating. The killer's DNA was sitting in police evidence. But whoever he was, he had either never been arrested for a qualifying offense, or his DNA had never entered the national system. It was like searching for a face in a crowd when that person had never had their photograph taken. Many departments would have accepted defeat, but the investigators assigned to Sylvia's case refused to destroy the evidence. Instead, they preserved every sample under carefully controlled conditions, believing that future technology might accomplish what the current generation could not. Meanwhile, Sylvia's sister continued doing something equally important. She refused to let people forget. Every anniversary of Sylvia's death, she contacted detectives. She attended media interviews. She reminded the public that behind every cold case file was a daughter, a sister, and a family still waiting for justice. Years became decades. Children grew into adults. New detectives replaced those who had retired. Computers became faster. DNA technology became more advanced. Yet one question remained exactly the same as it had on that August morning in 1981. Who killed Sylvia Mae Quayle? Then, nearly 4 decades after the murder, a revolutionary investigative technique began solving cases that everyone believed were impossible. It wasn't called fingerprint analysis. It wasn't called CODIS. It had a completely different name, genetic genealogy, and before long, it would completely change Sylvia's case forever. By the late 2010s, cold case investigations across America were entering a completely new era. Cases that had remained unsolved for 30 or 40 years were suddenly being reopened, not because detectives had found new witnesses, but because science had found a new way to identify people. The method was called genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for the suspect's own DNA inside criminal databases, investigators searched for distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to genealogy websites to learn about their family history. It was an idea that sounded almost impossible. The killer didn't have to upload his DNA. A second cousin, a third cousin, or even a distant relative could unknowingly become the first step toward identifying him. When investigators assigned to Sylvia's case learned about this technology, they knew they had one final opportunity. The preserved DNA evidence from 1981 was sent to forensic genealogy specialists. Unlike previous investigations, this process wasn't completed in days. It took months. Experts compared millions of DNA markers, studied historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census reports, military records, and family trees stretching back generations. The list of possible relatives slowly became smaller. Thousands of names became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Then, only a handful remained. One name immediately caught investigators' attention. The man had connections that placed him within reach of Colorado during the period surrounding Sylvia's murder. He had never appeared in the original investigation. His DNA had never entered CODIS, which explained why detectives had spent decades searching without success. For the first time in more than 40 years, investigators believed they were looking at the right person, but believing wasn't enough. In a courtroom, theories don't convict people. Evidence does. Detectives needed one thing they still didn't have: the suspect's own DNA. Without it, everything they had built could fall apart. So instead of making an arrest, investigators quietly began watching him. They never knocked on his door. They never accused him of anything. Instead, they waited. Every morning, surveillance teams followed his daily routine from a distance. They watched him leave home, drive to work, stop for groceries, visit convenience stores, return home. Day after day, nothing. Then one afternoon, the suspect stopped at a local convenience store. He walked inside, purchased a vanilla Coke, and returned to his vehicle. Detectives watched from a distance without saying a word. A few minutes later, he finished the drink, rolled down the window, and casually threw the empty aluminum can into a public trash bin. To him, it was just an empty soda can. To detectives, it was the most important piece of evidence they had been waiting 43 years to collect. The moment he drove away, investigators approached the trash bin wearing fresh gloves. The can was carefully removed, sealed inside an evidence bag, labeled, and immediately sent to the forensic laboratory. Nobody celebrated. Nobody made announcements. Everyone understood that everything now depended on one final comparison. If the DNA recovered from that discarded vanilla Coke can matched the DNA preserved from Sylvia Mae Quayle's murder scene, one of Colorado's oldest cold cases would finally have a name. And within days, the laboratory called, the results would shock everyone. The evidence arrived at the forensic laboratory under the strictest security procedures. The discarded vanilla Coke can was photographed, sealed, and carefully examined by forensic scientists. Wearing protective gloves, technicians searched the rim of the can for the smallest traces of saliva that could contain the suspect's DNA. Unlike television crime shows, this process wasn't completed in a few hours. Every step had to be perfect. One mistake could contaminate the sample. One error could destroy more than 40 years of investigation. After several days, the laboratory successfully developed a complete DNA profile from the can. Now came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The newly collected DNA would be compared with the biological evidence preserved from Sylvia Mae Quayle's murder scene since 1981. Inside the laboratory, scientists performed the comparison more than once. They wanted absolute certainty. The first analysis produced an astonishing result. The DNA profiles were consistent. The scientists repeated the examination using independent methods. The outcome remained exactly the same. There was no mistake. The DNA recovered from the discarded vanilla Coke can matched the DNA collected from Sylvia's home more than 4 decades earlier. When detectives received the laboratory report, the room fell completely silent. For years they had imagined this moment. Now it was finally real. One investigator slowly placed the report on the conference table and looked around the room, before saying, "We finally know who he is." For the first time in 43 years, Sylvia Mae Quayle's killer had a name instead of an unknown DNA profile. But investigators understood something important. A DNA match alone wasn't enough to close the case. Every detail had to be verified before an arrest could be made. Detectives immediately began reviewing the suspect's background. They traced his movements during the summer of 1981. They examined employment records, addresses, travel history, and every possible connection to Cherry Hills Village. Piece by piece, the timeline began fitting together. The suspect had been in Colorado during the same period Sylvia was murdered. Although he had never become a suspect in the original investigation, modern forensic science had uncovered what traditional police work never could. Investigators also reviewed every piece of physical evidence preserved since 1981. The chain of custody remained intact. The biological samples had been stored correctly. The laboratory procedures met modern forensic standards. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The case that had haunted Colorado for more than 4 decades was finally ready to move forward. But detectives had one final challenge. They needed to arrest a man who had spent decades believing he had escaped justice forever. He had no idea investigators had been watching him. He had no idea that an empty soda can had changed his life forever, and when police finally arrived at his door, the entire community would be left speechless. The laboratory report was now complete. Investigators had spent months building the case, but before making any move, they wanted independent experts to review every piece of evidence once again. The DNA comparison was verified. The genealogy research was verified. The chain of custody from 1981 was verified. Every document was carefully checked. After weeks of review, prosecutors agreed. There was enough evidence to move forward. An arrest warrant was issued. For the detectives who had worked on Sylvia Mae Quayle's case, it was a moment many thought they would never experience. Some of the original investigators had already retired. Others had passed away. Yet the evidence they preserved in 1981 had survived long enough to finally identify the man responsible. Early one morning, officers quietly surrounded the suspect's residence. Everything happened according to plan. There was no dramatic chase, no gunfire, no attempt to escape. The suspect was taken into custody without incident. As police vehicles left the neighborhood, many residents watched from their windows, confused about what was happening. Few of them realized they were witnessing the end of a murder investigation that had remained unsolved for more than 40 years. News of the arrest spread quickly across Colorado. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers published breaking headlines. For many people, it was almost impossible to believe. A case from 1981 had finally been solved. For Sylvia's family, the phone call from investigators brought emotions that words could hardly describe. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, there was always one empty place. And always one unanswered question. Who killed Sylvia? Now, for the first time in 43 years, they finally had an answer. Sylvia's sister later spoke about the investigation, thanking the detectives who refused, let the case disappear, and the forensic scientists whose work made the breakthrough possible. She explained that although nothing could bring Sylvia back, knowing the truth meant her sister would never be forgotten. Investigators also used the case to send an important message. Technology continues to evolve. Evidence once considered impossible to analyze may one day identify a suspect. That is why preserving evidence is so important. Even after decades, justice can still find its way. But one final chapter still remained: the courtroom. Would the prosecution be able to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt? And how would this investigation change the future of cold case investigations across the UNC of the United States? More than 43 years had passed since Sylvia Mae Quayle lost her life. The streets of Cherry Hills Village looked very different. The investigators were different. The technology was different. But inside the courtroom, the pain felt exactly the same. As the suspect appeared before the judge, members of Sylvia's family quietly took their seats. Some of them had waited almost their entire adult lives for this moment. For years they had lived without answers. Now they would finally hear the evidence that detectives had spent decades collecting. Prosecutors began by taking the jury back to August 4, 1981. They carefully explained how Sylvia's father had discovered his daughter's not prosciutto body inside her home, and how investigators immediately secured the scene. Every photograph, every forensic report, and every witness statement was presented in chronological order. Then came the most important part of the trial: the DNA evidence. Forensic experts explained how biological evidence collected in 1981 had been carefully preserved for decades. They described how modern laboratory techniques made it possible to recover a complete DNA profile from evidence that investigators could never fully analyze at the time. Next, experts explained genetic genealogy in simple language. Instead of identifying the suspect directly, investigators first located distant relatives through publicly available genealogy databases. That research helped narrow the search until detectives identified one individual who required further investigation. But the investigation didn't end there. The jury learned how detectives conducted discreet surveillance and legally recovered a discarded vanilla Coke can after the suspect threw it into a public trash bin. That can contained the DNA investigators needed. Laboratory scientists compared the DNA recovered from the can with the DNA preserved from Sylvia's crime scene. The result? A match. Not a partial match. Not a possible match. A scientifically supported DNA match that connected the suspect to the crime scene. The courtroom became completely silent. For Sylvia's family, hearing those words brought overwhelming emotions. For more than 4 decades they had wondered whether justice would ever come. Now, the evidence was finally speaking for Sylvia. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as people across Colorado followed every update. The case had become more than just another murder investigation. It was proof that time does not erase evidence. It simply waits for science to catch up. For detectives, this wasn't just about solving an old case. It was about keeping a promise made in 1981. A promise that Sylvia would never be forgotten. But before the trial reached its conclusion, the court still had one final decision to make. Would 43-year-old evidence be enough to secure justice? Or would one of Colorado's oldest cold cases face one last heartbreaking challenge?